In our final podcast episode of the year, we have put together some of the best sound bites from all the episodes in 2024. This year continues to be one of unfathomable loss and devastation as the genocide rages on in Gaza. At Al-Shabaka, we have tried to analyse and produce content that not only speaks to this pivotal moment in the Palestinian struggle for liberation, but it also challenges the hegemonic narratives that have contributed to this mass slaughter and Israeli regime impunity. From Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, I am Yara Hawari, and this is Rethinking Palestine. At the very start of the year, we spoke with Ilham Fakhro, a research fellow at the Exeter University's Centre for Gulf Studies, an associate fellow with the Chatham House MENA programme, on the Arab world and how it's responded to the genocide and how overwhelmingly the peoples of the region continue to stand with the Palestinian people.
There's been massive support for the Palestinians across the entire region, and I think that's quantifiable in three ways, actually. We've seen popular protests taking place across the Arab world, particularly, as you noted, in the countries where protests are more or less allowed. The numbers that we've seen coming out onto the streets in places like Jordan, Egypt, even Morocco, Yemen, haven't really been seen since, I would say, the Iraq War protests shook the region in 2003 and during the Second Intifada. So there's huge popular mass support for the Palestinians in Arab cities. We've also seen a revival of the boycott movement, a lot of support for BDS right now, particularly targeting the brands that support occupation, that support the settlements in particular. We've seen Starbucks targeted, McDonald's, even lesser known brands like Caribou Coffee. People do their research. Caribou, for example, operates in the settlements and people have targeted them as a result. So it's a really expansive boycott movement. Even Joe and the Juice, which is not a usual target for these movements, has also been targeted for boycott in places like Bahrain. So people on social media are really raising awareness of this. They're educating themselves when access to this information just isn't available on usual media networks and on the mainstream media. We're also seeing evidence of this support just in polling data that's been coming out in the past few weeks. So, for example, a recent poll from the Washington Institute in Washington, D.C. found that 96% of Saudis now oppose normalization with Israel. This is a jump from previous numbers. Another released from the Doha Institute found that 97% of Arabs experience psychological stress from the conflict in Gaza. People are deeply affected by the devastation and the genocide that they're seeing play out on a day-to-day basis. And I think it's interesting. I mean, I'll just anecdotally point out in my own experience, social media is flooded with images from Gaza, and it has been every single day for the past 3 months. People aren't letting up. You might expect there to be fatigue at this point, but there isn't. People are determined to keep awareness going and to keep pressure going as much as they can.
This stands in direct contrast to most of the Arab regimes who, by and large, have been complicit in the genocide and or have failed to use any leverage they might have to disrupt it. Abdullah Al-Arian, Assistant Professor of History at Georgetown University in Qatar and a Shabaka policy analyst, explained this disparity.
If you told someone even just a few years ago or a decade ago or more, the idea that the military capabilities of Arab states would be mobilized in support of an Israeli genocidal operation, a genocidal war that has been unleashed on Palestinians, people would say, no, that's a bridge too far. That's not something that Arab regimes could ever dream of doing, let alone actually putting into practice. And yet that's exactly what we've seen in terms of the mobilization of various Arab forces as a means of shielding Israel in the midst of its genocidal atrocities in Gaza, in the West Bank, by protecting them from any retaliatory strikes. If you told people just a decade ago that while the population of Gaza is being starved in the worst starvation policy and siege that we've seen in modern times, and yet the Arab states would be rerouting trade goods, food for Israelis, I think people would have been shocked and would have basically said, no, that could never happen, right? Despite everything we know about these regimes, that this would be something too far. And I think that has been quite shocking for a lot of people. I mean, we know, for instance, that Egypt has maintained its role in the siege of Gaza for going on 2 decades now. And yet what we're seeing now, I think, signals a kind of a drastic escalation, just given the severity of the humanitarian toll that this has all taken on Palestinians, to see that Arab states are only reacting to continue to invest in a regional security relationship that they believe is going to serve their interests. And again, the interests not of the people, but the interest of these regimes, that this is the only thing that is keeping them essentially in power, is this relationship. And so they're willing to do everything in that regard, even if it means dooming the people of Palestine to these horrific conditions. So I think that has obviously been, for many people, a surprise, despite everything we know, as I said, and despite all of that history. But seeing it kind of devolve to this level, I think has been really unnerving. And I think what this speaks to is one fact, which is I don't think that we've ever seen this much of a disparity, a gap between where the Arab populations are and where their leaders are.
Beyond the region, we have seen massive grassroots mobilization against the genocide. In the US earlier this year, campuses were awash with encampments and continuous demonstrations. Samir Al-Atoud, a Shabaka policy analyst and professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, was assaulted and detained by police at the encampment on his campus. He came on the podcast to share some important historical context of American student political mobilization.
There is a long history of student activism, and almost always those student activist movements have been brutalized by police force and police violence. And almost always they affected change. So while they are ongoing, they are faced with violence. And then within a decade or so, they seem to be succeeding in changing the discourse around, for example, Vietnam War or civil rights or apartheid South Africa. They seem to have changed the discourses around those, and you end up with a tidal kind of wave of change in general, right? Not only at the university level. And so usually when people talk about student movements in the US, people are often proud of those movements, of course, in hindsight, right? So for example, the university chancellor in the 1980s apologized about how the university dealt with the students during civil war, right? So they issued an official apology for how they brutalized the students in the 1960s and 70s. So they recognized that later on, but at the time that these movements happen, there is a lot of brutalization.
A crucial aspect of the genocide in Gaza has been the Israeli regime's disinformation apparatus, which has been used to normalize and legitimize violence against Palestinians on a barbaric scale. Al-Shabaka's US policy fellow Tariq Kanishawa explained in detail how this is done.
Israel recognized that the only way to get away with carrying out genocide in Gaza is by effectively controlling the information environment and deploying narratives that ultimately delegitimize Palestinians and justify their murder, their wholesale murder. And there are several tactics Israelis have used to these ends, but for ease of explanation, we can kind of divide Israel's disinformation strategy into three overarching prongs. The first being exaggerating the actions of Hamas and other Palestinian resistance groups, painting civilian targets as military targets, and discrediting and delegitimizing Palestinian voices and narratives to artificially create a fog of war to deter international intervention. And all of these are ultimately designed to justify genocide. So what does that look like in practice? We'll go through 1, 2, and 3. So when it comes to the actions of Hamas on October 7th, we've seen Israeli officials make horrific false claims. Just one example being the false claim that Hamas beheaded 40 babies. And of course, claims like these have been rapidly debunked, but not before they spread like wildfire, and not before they're repeated at levels as high up as, for example, the President of the United States. And it's clear what Israel is trying to achieve here. They want to paint Hamas and in turn paint Palestinians as a whole as brutal and violent, essentially deserving of whatever Israel does next. Once that foundation is laid, once those ideas are planted in people's minds, they really become a point of reference, regardless of their veracity and regardless of whether they're debunked, and they always are debunked. So that leads us to the next prong, or the next tactic, which argues that Palestinian civilians, those who have never taken part in any form of armed resistance, are legitimate military targets. And this is the claim that Hamas uses civilian infrastructure for military purposes or uses civilians as human shields. And that justifies somehow the killing of civilians. And a great example of this that we saw over the last couple of months is the case of a Shifa hospital, which has really come to represent a microcosm of Israel's unprecedented assault on Gaza's entire healthcare system.
The facts and figures of the genocide have been well documented and disseminated, but perhaps the lesser known aspect is the journey that survivors of the genocide made to reach Egypt. Ali, a Palestinian humanitarian aid worker from Gaza now in Cairo, described for us the agonizing and uncertain process of getting out of Gaza prior to May 2024, when the Rafah crossing was taken over by Israeli regime forces.
From November to early December, those who managed to escape to Cairo had to catch up over, $12,000 per person, even for the kids. And here's the kicker: there is no guarantees. This money often went to coordinators who scammed family out of their money. Some people even paid extra, hoping it would speed up the things, only to end on a list connecting to Egyptian nationalities. But on the other hand, by the mid-January, things shifting a bit with Yahala company coming back. They charge a person $5,000 over 16 years old. And for the kids, it's $2,150. While it seems more organized, but it was still messy. There's 1,000 registering daily, but only 300 to 315 names get deposited each day because of the Israel restrictions and security check. This journey is full of uncertainty and fear. Once you're registering, there is no turning back, and you wait like 20 to 13 days, holding your breath, hoping your name will get approval. Tragically, some people don't survive the war long enough to see their name coming up. Physically, the trip is brutal. Imagine having with almost nothing, crossing danger, bombarding areas at Rafah crossing. After you finally get to the Palestinian side, you are stuck waiting 4 to 8 hours on the Egyptian side under harsh conditions. You cannot move around or asking questions. And if you ask many times, you got shouted at, definitely. Some refugees had to walk over 10 kilometers from the northern Gaza to the crossing, exhausting and in need of rest. This journey it's a testament to the resilience and strength of the humanity spirit.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please visit our website, al-shabaka.org, where you will find more Palestinian policy analysis and where you can join our mailing list and donate to support our work. The horror in Gaza has not been happening in a vacuum. As the Israeli regime continues to bombard Gaza less than 100 kilometers away in the West Bank, annexation, land theft, settler and soldier violence continue at an alarming pace. Al-Shabaka's Palestine policy fellow Fatih Nimr explains how this is part and parcel of the larger Zionist project.
The plans for the West Bank can't be seen in separation from the plans of the Gaza Strip. I mean, even from the beginning of the war, people were talking about pushing the people, the Palestinians of Gaza, out into Sinai and reestablishing settlements again. This is not different at all from what's happening in the West Bank and what they are planning for the West Bank, or what they would like to happen in the West Bank. Expanding more settlements, kicking out more Palestinians. This is all part of the same, struggle. It's part of the same colonization efforts. We can't look at it separately from what's going on, even in Jerusalem or even within 48. It's all connected. And I think one of the biggest successes really of the occupation of 67 is that it's really tried to reinforce these kind of segmentation of Palestinian society and to kind of make this a fact of life and a natural part, rather than it being something imposed on us very recently.
In a joint episode with the Magdisi Street podcast, I elaborated on this further. We heard the Israeli Foreign Minister Israel Katz say that this would be a war for everything. and that it would include, as you mentioned, the so-called temporary evacuation of Palestinian residents from the West Bank. And we know that that language is code for ethnic cleansing. I mean, it's not particularly good code, but that's what they mean when they say it. And, Palestinians are not, they know that this is not separate to what's happening in Gaza. Israelis use different tactics for different communities, but the end goal is always the same. In Gaza, they're committing genocide. In the West Bank, we've seen over decades this incremental use of forced displacement, of incarceration, of colonization. And the end goal is to squeeze as many Palestinians in even less and less land. So it's less Palestinians for more land. And I think the scary thing is that the Israeli army, the Israeli regime now see this as an opportunity. They see that they've gotten away with killing tens of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza and obliterating Gaza, and they have yet to face any consequences from the international community. Okay, yes, we had, the ICJ come out and say that there are plausible acts of genocide, but it hasn't resulted in any kind of sanctions. And actually, on the contrary, they've been rewarded. They've been rewarded for their actions in Gaza with continuing diplomatic relations, with increased arms sales. This is really a prime opportunity for them to launch something a lot more serious in the West Bank because they know they'll get away with it. And I think that's something that a lot of Palestinians are fearing, but I think it's also something that we've always known. We've always known that they're not going to stop, at Tel Aviv. They're not going to stop Ascalon. They're not going to stop at Yafa and Haifa. The end goal has always been the whole of Palestine, and we've known that all along. And I think we've been gaslit for so long by the international community with the sort of promotion of the facade of the two states and the respect for international law. And that's what it's been. It's been consistent gaslighting for over 7.5 decades. In July of 2024, the UK elected the Labour Party into government, and foreign policy platforms were unsurprisingly a major talking point during the campaigns. Whilst the major parties continued to follow a line that would ensure continued complicity with the Israeli regime's genocidal actions, it was quite clear that Gaza had united a wide cross-section of British society. Sarah Husseini, director of the British Palestinian Committee and Al-Shabaka policy analyst, explained this for us.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And what you're pointing to there is something that has happened despite a really difficult environment. There's a dynamic that we've been seeing playing out through the elections and beyond. Attempts, particularly by the previous government, elephants, the mainstream media, to stir up real divisions in the UK, to kind of frame or try and make Palestine a sectarian issue, a Muslim issue, a matter of Muslim-Jewish communal tensions, and sort of stoke these kind of culture wars. When actually what we've seen, as you've said, is we know in reality, and what we've seen has been quite the opposite. Palestine has actually been a singularly unifying issue. We've seen that in the hundreds and thousands of people taking to the streets every week in, week out, over the past 9 months. And people, from all communities, struggles, walks of life. And that's been reflected also then, as we're speaking now in the election, in terms of the election of not only the independents, the Greens, but also the really narrowing Labour margins of victory in very, very many constituencies that have gone, are less reported, but are very important to take note of. So Palestine really, people understand that this Palestine is not a singular issue. It's an issue of our collective humanity. It's an issue that unites people and brings people together because they see the injustice and recognise that.
Across the short stretch of sea from the UK, in Ireland, solidarity with the Palestinian struggle has a long history. Whilst there are many similarities between the Irish struggle for freedom and that of the Palestinian one, there are also problematic attempts to copy Irish peace and reconciliation efforts in Palestine. Brendan Brown, interdisciplinary scholar at Trinity College Dublin, explained why this continues to be a harmful practice.
Who in their right mind is going to say that peace building is problematic? That you come across as some kind of lunatic if you say that, But actually, you're weaponizing peace building when you try and impose it upon people without their, addressing lots of the structural issues in the room. In our own context, in the north of Ireland as well, we have made great attempts at engaging in sort of people-to-people type projects on the ground in Belfast. I was a product of these products, but whereas in the sort of 80s and 90s, they didn't really work as well because the wider political reality wasn't addressed, the wider structural problems weren't being addressed. We were just being brought together to sort of talk to each other and assume that that would be enough to trickle down and build peace. What's happening, and we have, as you've pointed to, what's happening is people are bringing that model of contact theory, people to people processes, as you've written about yourself, Yara, in the past, and bringing them into the Palestine context and saying, look, if you only talk to each other, things like this will get better in the future, without actually saying, well, no, we need to radically look at the way society is structured here. We need to look at the militarized nature of Israeli society. We need to look at the rights that you enjoy and that I don't enjoy. So I do think it's really important. And the last point I would make on that, and maybe this is a bit cynical, is that it's become quite a big business. It's big industry. You know, exporting the peace process from Northern Ireland has seen a proliferation of NGOs who've made this their modus operandi and exported it to other conflict zones, not just Palestine, by the way, but to other spaces. And I think when you do that, you flatten power dynamics in a way that is deeply, deeply problematic. And I really wish people would stop doing it.
In November, we also saw elections in the US, and Americans voted in Donald J. Trump for a second term. Al-Shabaka's US policy fellow, Tariq Kanishawa, explained what might be in store with this incoming administration.
What we should expect is essentially just a closer relationship with Israel, and one that's a lot more unapologetic. But we also need to recognize that Trump is known to be unpredictable, and he's known to be a lot more transactional and self-interested than Biden. So where Biden was kind of a self-avowed Zionist, right? And he was a proud Zionist, and he really made sacrifices, or what he saw as sacrifices, for what he believed to be Israel's self-interest and Israel's defense. I don't see Trump doing the same thing or taking the same approach. So, for example, where Biden was willing to deploy U.S. troops and assets to come to Israel's defense, there's a question as to whether Trump would do the same, because he might see that as violating his America First principles, or making it more difficult for him to achieve his wider goals of, for example, expanding the Abraham Accords, reaching an agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia. So if where Biden was willing to sacrifice U.S. and regional interests for the defense of Israel, Trump might not be as willing to do so. That's where we might start to see some differences in how the two administrations interact with Israel directly. But then it's also extremely important to consider the fact that Trump is going to be surrounding himself with some of the most bloodthirsty neocon war hawks in U.S. history. So these are people like Brian Hook, Marco Rubio, Mike Huckabee, Jared Kushner, who all will attempt to drag Trump into more confrontational U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. They'll have no reservations about deploying U.S. forces and assets. And I think this will come into conflict a lot with Trump's America First approach and Trump's reluctance to actually spend money and actually devote resources to these conflicts. But in many ways, I think the more concerning fact are the people that Trump surrounds him with. And these are the people who will go to bat for any wider regional war and definitely try to drag the administration in with it.
In our penultimate episode of the year, Al-Shabaka board president Tariq Baqani sums up this moment for the Palestinian struggle and offers some reflections for moving forward.
Strategically and politically, I think the Palestinian movement is immense today. It's bigger than it has been for a long time. And I think we now have global support and grassroots power and allies and solidarities in ways that would have been unimaginable this time last year. At the same time, I think that we need to be more strategic in terms of how we push this popular power forward. How do we develop political power? How are we able to engage with questions of international law, with foreign policy towards global South actors, with questions around global governance? These are strategic questions. And not coincidentally, by design, our leadership, our revolutionary leadership of the past, of the 60s and 70s, has been co-opted and emptied of content and imprisoned and exiled and executed. And we need to rebuild that. We're coming out of 3-4 decades of the narrowing out of our revolutionary potential. as Palestinians, our institutional power, to sort of carry out a decolonial agenda. And we need to rebuild that. And it's urgent that we rebuild that, because in the absence of that, I think foreign interests and certainly Western hegemony will try to reassert a paradigm that certainly does not center Palestinians or Palestinian rights. So the question for me today is, how do we think about this moment post October 7th, this moment of genocide? How do we think about it as a way of resuscitating our revolutionary legacy, of going back into our roots and bringing out a political project, a decolonial project that's not about going back to the past, because there's no going back, but it's rather about how do we think about decolonization and revolutionary politics today, in this day and age, thinking about all of these global challenges. And I think that's our most urgent task to date.
Thank you for listening to our End of Year podcast. Each month, we have strived to bring you the most cutting-edge analysis from Palestinian experts, and this episode has showcased some of the very best bits. At Al-Shabaka, we have been devastated and horrified by the genocide in Gaza that has been ongoing for over 14 months. We have also been moved by the unwavering support around the world for the Palestinian struggle amidst one of our darkest moments in history. There are many challenges that lie ahead, and we know that the path will not be easy. But we as an organisation recommit ourselves to Palestinian liberation and the struggle for a better and just world. If you want to support our work, please visit our website where you can find out more about how to do so. Rethinking Palestine is brought to you by Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. Al-Shabaka is the only global independent Palestinian think tank whose mission is to produce critical policy analysis and collectively imagine a new policy-making paradigm for Palestine and Palestinians worldwide. For more information or to donate to support our work, visit al-shabaka.org. And importantly, don't forget to subscribe to Rethinking Palestine wherever you listen to podcasts.